Story 1. The elevator that skipped floors. You ever notice how some elevators don't have a 13th floor? Well, I'm here to tell you that's a lie. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they take you there, whether you want to go or not. It was just another late night at the office. I'd been swamped with deadlines all week, and by the time I finished, it was past midnight. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, and the office felt unnervingly quiet. My desk lamp was the only source of light, and the hum of the HVAC system was the only sound. I gathered my things, threw my bag over my shoulder, and headed toward the elevator. I remember feeling this weird tension in my chest as I approached it, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. You know that paranoia you get when you're alone in a big, empty building? It was like that. The elevator doors slid open with their usual metallic groan. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby, already dreaming of my bed. That's when I noticed something off. The elevator panel looked wrong. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but the numbers weren't in their usual order. The 13 button was there, right between 12 and 14, but it looked different, old, scratched, like it had been there for decades while the other buttons were pristine. I frowned and stared at it for a moment. I'd been working in this building for years, and there'd never been a 13th floor before. I figured maybe the maintenance team replaced the panel and added it as a joke or something. I even laughed under my breath at the idea. But the longer I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. So, naturally, I pressed it. Nothing happened. The button didn't light up like the others. It didn't even click. It felt stuck, dead under my finger. Whatever. I muttered and hit the lobby button again. The elevator started moving, down at first, just like normal. But after a few seconds, it shuddered violently, the lights flickering overhead. My stomach lurched as the car jolted to a stop between floors. Great! I groaned, pressing the emergency button. But before I could hear a response, the elevator started moving again. Only this time, it wasn't going down. It was going up, and it didn't stop. The numbers on the display blinked and flickered erratically, skipping floors entirely. 8, 10, 12, 14. Then something weird happened. The display showed 13. My chest tightened. That wasn't possible. There was no 13th floor in this building. That much I knew for certain. The elevator slowed to a stop, and the doors creaked open. What I saw made my skin crawl. The floor was dark, lit only by the faint glow of emergency lights. The air smelled stale, like mildew and rot, and there was this oppressive silence, broken only by faint whispers. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, but they seemed to echo from everywhere at once. I pressed the close door button, my hand shaking, but the elevator didn't respond. The doors stayed open, almost as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Then I saw movement. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, wearing a tattered hood that obscured its face. Its clothes looked old, filthy, like they'd been buried for years. The whispers grew louder as it stepped into the elevator, the sound rising to a chorus of incoherent murmurs. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. The figure turned toward me, its head tilting unnaturally to one side, as though it were trying to study me. Then, in a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping against concrete, it said, "You weren't supposed to come here." Before I could respond, the elevator began to move again. Only this time, it wasn't rising. It was plummeting. I screamed, clutching the railings as the car hurtled downward, faster and faster. The lights flickered violently, and the walls of the elevator seemed to warp, bending inward like they were being crushed. The figure didn't react. It just stood there, staring at me. Just as I braced for impact, the elevator stopped abruptly with a bone-rattling jolt. The doors slid open again, and I realized I was back in the lobby. But something wasn't right. The lobby looked normal at first glance, but as I stepped out of the elevator, I noticed the air felt wrong. Too heavy, too still. The security desk was occupied by at least a dozen guards, all standing perfectly still. Their faces were blank, expressionless, as if someone had wiped away their features and left nothing but hollow masks. None of them moved. None of them blinked. They just stared at me. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What the hell is going on?" They didn't respond. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the front doors. The moment I stepped outside, I froze. The night sky wasn't black. It was red, a sickly, pulsating red, like the inside of a body. The air smelled of burnt metal, and the streetlights buzzed unnaturally, their light casting strange, shifting shadows that didn't match the shapes of anything around me. The world felt wrong, like I'd stepped into some twisted version of reality. I kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The further I got from the building, the more I felt like something was watching me. I glanced back over my shoulder and stopped dead in my tracks. The building was gone. In its place was a massive, pulsating shadow, and I could hear it hum, a low, mechanical hum, like the sound of an elevator motor. It was following me. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could feel it vibrating in my chest. I turned around slowly, trembling, and saw a shadow looming behind me. It stretched taller and taller, reaching for me. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the faint ding of an elevator door opening. Story 2. The Stranger in the Elevator Mirror. There's a mirror in every elevator. But have you ever wondered why? It's not just for checking your hair. It's for keeping an eye on what's behind you. I wish I'd known that before I moved into this building. It was my first night in the new apartment. Everything was still in boxes, scattered haphazardly around the tiny living room. I had spent the whole day lugging my stuff up and down the elevator, sweating and swearing under my breath. Moving alone was a pain, but I kept telling myself it was worth it. The apartment was cheap, had a great view, and was walking distance to work. A steal, really. The last box of the night was heavier than it had any right to be. I hadn't labeled it, and I couldn't for the life of me remember what was in it. I grunted, wrestled it into my arms, and shuffled into the elevator, the door sliding shut behind me. That's when I noticed the mirror. It ran the entire back wall of the elevator, floor to ceiling, seamless, almost too pristine. I caught a glimpse of myself, red-faced and sweaty, and rolled my eyes. Looking good, I muttered sarcastically, adjusting the box in my arms. I hit the button for the 6th floor, and the elevator hummed to life. But as it started to ascend, something about my reflection caught my attention. It was subtle at first, just a fraction of a second, but my reflection seemed slower than me. I blinked. I shifted the box slightly, leaning to the side, and in the mirror, my reflection hesitated for a beat before mimicking the movement. "What the?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the elevator. I chalked it up to exhaustion. Moving was stressful, and I was dead tired. Maybe I was imagining things. Still, the longer I watched the mirror, the weirder it seemed. My reflection wasn't quite in sync with me. It was like watching a video with a half-second delay. Just to test it, I raised my free hand and waved. My reflection didn't wave back. Instead, it tilted its head to the side, as if studying me. Then slowly, deliberately, it smiled. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The smile wasn't mine. It was too wide, too sharp, stretching just a little too far. My knees felt like jelly as I stared at the reflection. My own face stared back at me, but it wasn't me. It couldn't be. Panic set in. My hands fumbled for the elevator controls, and I stabbed at the emergency stop button. The elevator jerked to a halt, the sudden motion almost making me drop the box. The lights flickered. Then the elevator shuddered, and a low ding echoed through the shaft. The doors creaked open, but instead of the 6th floor, I was met with nothing. Just pitch-black darkness. The air beyond the door was icy cold, and it smelled like damp earth and rust. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, clutching the box like it could somehow protect me. That's when I heard it, a whisper. Faint, almost drowned out by the sound of my own breathing, but unmistakable. It said my name. The voice was soft, sing-song, like it was calling to me from somewhere far away. But it wasn't far. It was right there, just beyond the open doors. I mashed the button for the 6th floor over and over, my hands trembling. The doors groaned shut, and the elevator jolted back to life, moving upward again. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself, but when I glanced at the mirror, my reflection wasn't alone anymore. There was something standing behind it, a shadowy figure, tall and thin, its shape barely distinct. It loomed over my reflection's shoulder, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. My reflection didn't look scared. It didn't even look at the figure. It just kept smiling that same too-wide grin. I turned around, expecting, no praying, to see nothing behind me. And I didn't. The elevator was empty. But when I turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there. The elevator dinged, and the doors opened to the 6th floor. I stumbled out, almost tripping over the box in my arms. The hallway was empty and eerily quiet. I glanced back at the elevator, half expecting the doors to stay open, revealing the shadowy figure waiting for me. But they slid shut, leaving me alone. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to steady my breathing. My reflection hadn't followed me out. Whatever I'd seen in the mirror was gone, or so I thought. I turned toward my apartment, and that's when I saw it. The hallway was lined with mirrors. Cheap, decorative ones hung at regular intervals. And in every single one, I saw the same thing, me carrying the box. But behind me, in every reflection, the shadowy figure stood. My blood turned to ice. I spun around, dropping the box with a loud thud. The hallway was empty. Nothing but bare walls and dim, flickering lights. I looked back at the nearest mirror. The figure was still there, hovering inches behind my reflection. Its head twitched, snapping toward the glass as if it knew I was watching. I bolted for my apartment, fumbling with the keys as I reached the door. The mirrors seemed to stretch endlessly on either side of me, each one showing the same thing, the shadow growing closer. Finally, I got the door open, slammed it behind me, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the deadbolt steady. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. My apartment was quiet, normal. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe the stress of the move was getting to me. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw the mirror on the wall near the entrance. The shadowy figure was there, standing directly behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. And now, every mirror in my apartment shows the same thing. Me, standing frozen, and it always behind me waiting. Story 3. The Silent Passenger. I've always hated small talk in elevators. But silence? Silence is so much worse, especially when you're not the only one in there. It was a Monday morning, and I was running late for work. The office building was packed as usual, the lobby buzzing with people scurrying in every direction. I squeezed into the elevator, which was already crowded. A guy with headphones was scrolling through his phone. A woman in a blazer clutched a coffee cup, and a couple of younger men in tech company hoodies chatted quietly in the corner. I pressed the button for the 18th floor, wedging myself into the back. The doors closed with a soft ding, and the elevator began its slow ascent. No one spoke. That's just the way it is in elevators. Everyone keeps their eyes on their phones or the floor, pretending no one else exists. One by one, people started getting off at their stops. By the time we passed the 10th floor, the car was nearly empty. The only other person left was an elderly man standing near the front, wearing a gray suit that looked a little outdated, like something from the 70s. He wasn't facing the buttons or even the doors. He just stood there, staring blankly at the far wall. I barely noticed him at first, too preoccupied with checking my phone and mentally running through my day's to-do list. But then, a foul smell hit me, a sharp, cloying stench like spoiled meat left in the sun. I wrinkled my nose and glanced up at the man. He hadn't moved. He didn't even look like he was breathing. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his suit hung off him like it didn't fit quite right. The elevator stopped at the 12th floor. The doors slid open with their usual mechanical groan, but no one got on. The man didn't move. He hadn't pressed a button for a floor, I realized. He was just standing there, swaying ever so slightly like a tree in a light breeze. I tried to ignore the unease creeping into my gut. Maybe he was lost or confused. He was old, after all. Which floor are you heading to? I asked, forcing a polite smile. The man didn't respond. I cleared my throat, louder this time. Hey, do you need help? What floor? The elevator lights flickered, cutting me off mid-sentence. For a split second, everything went pitch black. When the lights came back on, the man was gone. My stomach dropped. I whipped my head around, scanning the elevator. It was empty. Completely empty. I let out a shaky laugh, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Must have gotten off, I muttered under my breath, though I knew he hadn't. The elevator hadn't stopped again. I reached out to press the emergency button, but before I could touch it, the elevator jolted violently, sending me stumbling back against the wall. The hum of the machinery shifted, and the elevator began to descend. Fast. Wait, what the hell? I stammered, frantically pressing the button for the lobby. The elevator ignored me, picking up speed. The numbers on the display started flashing, then glitching. Instead of floor numbers, strange symbols appeared. Lines, circles, shapes I didn't recognize. I jabbed at the emergency stop button, but it didn't do anything. The elevator lights flickered again, and for a moment, the mirror-like metal walls of the elevator warped, bending inward like they were being pulled by something outside. Then the lights came back, and the man was there again. He was standing right in front of me, closer than before. Too close. His face was unervingly blank, his eyes milky and unseeing, but they were fixed directly on me. His jaw hung slack, and his breath reeked of decay. I stumbled back into the corner, my hands shaking. What? What do you want? He didn't answer. His head twitched slightly, a sharp, unnatural motion like a broken doll. The elevator shuddered and continued its descent, faster and faster. I could feel the pressure building in my ears, the air growing heavier, colder. My pulse thundered in my chest as the numbers on the display disappeared entirely, replaced by a blank, glowing red screen. And still, the man didn't move. The elevator finally came to a screeching halt. The force of it sent me to my knees, the stale smell of his presence choking me. My palms pressed against the cold floor as I gasped for air, my heart racing. The doors slid open, and I blinked at the sight in front of me. It wasn't the lobby. It wasn't even a floor I recognized. The space beyond the elevator was vast and dimly lit, stretching endlessly in every direction. The floor was a dull, reflective black, like polished stone, and dozens of figures stood motionless in the distance. They were all wearing gray suits. The man in the elevator stepped out, his movements jerky, as if his limbs were on strings. I tried to stay back, but an invisible force seemed to pull me toward the open doors. The figures turned as one, their faces pale and featureless, save for those milky, unseeing eyes. They all looked like him. "Welcome," the man said, his voice sharp and distorted, like it was coming from an old cassette tape. His lips twisted into a grotesque grin. "We've been waiting for you." My body refused to move as the figures began to approach, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the vast, empty space. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw was the elevator doors sliding shut, the man's face peeking through the gap as he smiled wider than any human should be able to. And then nothing. I woke up in the elevator, back in the lobby of my building, gasping for air like I'd been drowning. The doors slid open, and people streamed in, chatting, checking their phones like nothing had happened. But the stench of rotting meat still lingered. And every time I step into the elevator now, I swear I can feel him there, standing just behind me waiting. Story 4. The voices between floors. Elevators are supposed to stop between floors sometimes. What's not supposed to happen is hearing voices coming from outside the walls. It was nearly 1 a.m. when I got back to the hotel, dead tired and ready to collapse. The day had been endless. Meetings, delayed flights, a dinner that had gone way too long. All I wanted was to get to my room on the 15th floor, take a hot shower, and pass out. The lobby was empty, eerily quiet except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. I shuffled into the elevator, yawning as the doors slid shut behind me. The interior was sleek and modern, one of those fancy elevators with touch screens instead of buttons. I tapped 15 on the panel, leaned back against the wall, and closed my eyes. The ride started smoothly enough. The hum of the motor and the soft whir of cables were almost soothing. But as the elevator passed the 10th floor, it shuddered violently and came to an abrupt stop. I sighed, opening my eyes. "Of course," I muttered. "Just my luck." I tapped the touch screen, but it was frozen. None of the buttons worked. I rolled my eyes, chalking it up to bad maintenance. This wasn't the first time I'd been stuck in an elevator. It's annoying, sure, but usually nothing serious. I reached for the emergency call button and pressed it. The speaker crackled to life. Relief flooded through me. At least someone was on the other end. But instead of a voice asking how they could help, what came through was wrong. A distorted, static-laden voice whispered, "Don't move." I froze, my fingers still hovering over the button. "What?" The voice came again, louder this time, crackling and warped, as though the speaker were submerged underwater. "Don't move. They can't see you if you don't move." My stomach clenched. Who is this? What the hell is going on? The speaker went silent, and then I heard them, the voices. They were faint at first, just soft murmurs coming from somewhere beyond the elevator walls. I pressed my ear to the cold metal, straining to make them out. It sounded like a conversation, but the words were garbled, overlapping, like a dozen people whispering all at once. "Hello!" I called out, my voice shaking. The murmurs stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the walls of the elevator groaned, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I stumbled back, watching in horror as the metal began to warp, bulging inward as if something, or someone, was pressing against it from the other side. My heart pounded in my chest. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. The voices returned, louder now, surrounding me. They whispered my name, stretching it out like a taunt. Sam. I pressed myself into the corner, squeezing my eyes shut. My hands fumbled for my phone, but when I pulled it out, the screen was black, unresponsive. The elevator groaned again, the walls trembling as the voices grew even louder. A metallic scraping sound echoed through the shaft, sharp and rhythmic, like claws raking against steel. And then silence. The lights flickered back on, blinding me for a moment. My chest heaved as I blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. The elevator was moving again, but instead of going up, it was descending fast. I looked at the display screen. The numbers were wrong. Instead of floor numbers, there were symbols, lines, circles, and strange, jagged shapes that made no sense. The voices whispered again, this time in unison. "You shouldn't have listened." I felt sick, my head spinning as the elevator continued to plunge downward. It didn't stop until the display went blank, the screen glowing a dim, pulsating red. The door slid open with a soft ding. I hesitated, peering out into the space beyond. My breath caught in my throat. It was my hotel room. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The suitcase propped against the wall, the half-empty water bottle on the nightstand, even the curtains slightly drawn to reveal a sliver of city lights. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the room was too still, too silent. My eyes were drawn to the bed. There was someone in it. No, not someone. Something. It was shaped like me, lying on its side, the blankets pulled up to its chin. Its face was turned away, but I could see enough. The curve of its shoulder. The way its chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. I stepped out of the elevator, my legs trembling beneath me. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The thing in the bed didn't move. I inched closer, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. As I reached the edge of the bed, I stretched out a shaking hand to touch the blanket. The elevator doors slammed shut behind me, making me jump. I spun around, but the elevator was gone. I turned back to the bed and froze. The thing lying there wasn't me anymore. Its head had turned, revealing a face that was almost mine, but not quite. The features were stretched, distorted, the eyes too wide, and the mouth twisted into a sickening grin. It sat up slowly, tilting its head as it stared at me. "Welcome back," it said in my voice. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. The room began to warp, the walls bending inward, just like the elevator had. The last thing I saw before the lights went out was its grin, impossibly wide, and its eyes, black, endless voids that swallowed everything. Now I'm sitting here, trapped in the dark, listening to the voices. They're louder now, closer, and they won't stop whispering my name. If you're reading this and you hear voices in an elevator, don't listen. And whatever you do, don't move. Story 5. The elevator that eats time. I only spent 5 minutes in that elevator. When the doors opened, I discovered 5 years had passed. The day started like any other. Rushed, stressful, a little chaotic. I was on my way to a job interview downtown, running late because my alarm had decided to give up on life, and traffic was a nightmare. By the time I reached the office building, I was a sweaty, frazzled mess. I straightened my tie in the lobby's reflective glass doors, trying to look presentable, and hurried to the elevators. The building was sleek and modern, with a vast atrium and marble floors that echoed with the sound of my hurried footsteps. An elevator dinged, and I slipped in, thankful I didn't have to wait. I hit the button for the 22nd floor and leaned against the wall, pulling out my phone to check the time. I still had a few minutes to spare. The elevator hummed to life, but almost immediately I noticed something was off. The ride felt slow. I glanced at the display above the doors. The numbers ticked up normally at first, 2, 3, 4, but then it got stuck on 6. I frowned, tapping my foot impatiently. "Come on," I muttered, glancing at my phone. That's when I noticed my phone wasn't working. The screen flickered, showing random strings of numbers and letters, like code, before freezing completely. I locked and unlocked it, but the time had disappeared, replaced by a series of strange symbols I didn't recognize. "What the hell?" I mumbled, shaking the phone as if that would help. The elevator continued to hum, but the display still read 6. I hit the door open button, but nothing happened. The emergency button didn't respond either. Panic started creeping in, but before I could completely lose it, the elevator dinged. Finally, the doors slid open with a groan, and I stepped out into the hallway, my irritation bubbling over. But the moment I looked around, my stomach dropped. This wasn't right. The office was empty. Not just empty of people, but abandoned. Dust coated every surface, and the air was heavy and stale, carrying the faint scent of mold. The once shiny desks were covered in grime, and the chairs were scattered like someone had left in a hurry. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I wandered further into the office, my footsteps kicking up little clouds of dust. On one of the desks, a stack of old newspapers caught my eye. The headline read, "Market Crashes as Pandemic Grips World." The date below the headline made my blood run cold. It was 5 years from today. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. No, this is to be a joke." I grabbed the paper, staring at the date until the numbers blurred. It didn't make sense. I'd only been in the elevator for a few minutes. How could 5 years have passed? A faint crackle came from somewhere nearby, breaking the suffocating silence. My head snapped up, and I realized it was coming from the elevator's intercom. "You can't go back," a distorted voice whispered. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty office. "You took too long," the voice hissed. "It's too late." I stumbled back toward the elevator, my heart pounding. The doors were still open, but when I tried to step inside, they slammed shut with a deafening clang. I pressed the button to call it back, but the light didn't even flicker. Panic set in. I bolted for the stairwell, throwing open the heavy door. The concrete stairs spiraled downward, lit by dim, flickering lights. I ran, taking the steps 2 at a time, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. But when I reached the next landing and pushed open the door, I froze. It was the same office, the same abandoned desks, the same dust-covered chairs, the same faint smell of mold. "No," I whispered, backing away. "This isn't real. This isn't real." I turned and sprinted down the stairs again, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder. Another landing, another door. I burst through it and found myself back in the same office. My chest heaved as I leaned against the doorframe, sweat dripping down my face. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no explanation. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, but the stairwell was empty. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a figure emerged from the shadows. It was me. or something that looked like me. They were disheveled, their clothes torn and dirty. Their face was pale and gaunt, their eyes sunken and hollow. They stared at me with an expression I couldn't place. Was it anger? Sadness? Pity? You didn't listen, they said, their voice hoarse and broken. I stumbled back, my back hitting the wall. What are you? They didn't answer. Instead, they reached out, their hand trembling, and pointed toward the elevator. I turned, and to my horror, the elevator doors were open again. The light inside flickered, casting eerie shadows. I'm not going in there, I said, shaking my head. The other me didn't respond. They just stood there pointing, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I had no choice. My legs felt like lead as I approached the elevator, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where would I go? Every door led back here. I stepped inside, my hands trembling as I pressed the button for the lobby. The panel had changed. There was only one button now, labeled Restart. No, I whispered, backing away. But the doors slid shut before I could escape, trapping me inside. The elevator hummed to life, and I felt it begin to move. This time, I didn't know where it was taking me. As the walls began to warp and the lights flickered, I had a horrible realization. I'd been here before, and I'd made the same mistake every time. The last thing I heard before the elevator plunged into darkness was my own voice, whispering, "You took too long." Thanks for watching. If you like the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.